President Donald J. Trump is preparing to step onto the global stage, even as fresh fighting has erupted in Gaza and questions swirl over a fragile ceasefire. At the same time, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has ordered a series of potent strikes in response to what Israeli officials call a major breach of the truce. As the US president begins a high-stakes diplomatic swing, with stops in Japan, South Korea, and a planned meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, the Middle East once again is threatening to derail a broader strategy of regional stabilization and economic summits. From the outset, the US administration had projected confidence the president will travel to Japan, then to South Korea, where a major economic summit awaits, before meeting China's Xi Jinping. That itinerary underscores the administration's push to recast US foreign policy around trade, strategic alliances, and high-stakes global diplomacy. Yet, even as Washington signals its global ambitions, turmoil in the Gaza Strip is reasserting the limits of diplomatic handiwork. Israeli officials accuse Hamas of firing across what Jerusalem calls the yellow line into Israeli-controlled territory in southern Gaza, a move described by the Israeli military as a very serious incident. In response, Israel launched a series of airstrikes across Gaza following high-level security consultations with Prime Minister Netanyahu. As the dust settles, each side has laid blame. The Israeli Defense Minister issued a blunt warning. The Hamas terrorist organization will pay a heavy price for attacking IDF soldiers in Gaza and for violating the agreement on the return of the deceased hostages. At the same time, Israel claims a ceasefire violation. Hamas rejects involvement, claiming Israeli attacks undermine the deal. Israel insists the ceasefire will be enforced. They have violated the ceasefire by not giving our hostages back, and they are firing at our troops. Israel will enforce the ceasefire. We believe in the ceasefire, but we will enforce it. These are crucial remarks from the Israeli side, reflecting a mixture of commitment to the truce and readiness to punish its breaches. Hamas, however, says it will not release a body tonight, as planned, because of what it claims are Israeli violations of the ceasefire agreement. Adding complexity, Israel says 13 bodies of hostages remain inside Gaza after the group released partial remains of one hostage who was already accounted for. That unresolved hostage and remains issue remains a potent flashpoint. Washington is not at the front lines of the shooting, but its diplomatic backing, logistical support and political influence matter more than ever. On Capitol Hill, Vice President J.D. Vance appeared optimistic about the broader ceasefire effort. Even amid today's breach, he told reporters, that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be little skirmishes here and there. We expect the Israelis are going to respond, but I think the president's peace is going to hold despite phase 2 of the ceasefire is already being discussed. And despite the violation today, it is expected to move forward as planned. That statement underscores the administration's dual strategy: support the ceasefire while acknowledging the inevitable volatility on the ground. Analysts say this balancing act, advancing large-scale diplomacy while managing immediate security crises, defines the moment. From Jerusalem's vantage point, the ceasefire is no excuse for inaction. Prime Minister Netanyahu and his defense team appear to view today's incident as a provocation that requires a strong, visible response. The stated goal is twofold: send a clear deterrent message to Hamas and reassure the Israeli public that a truce is not synonymous with paralysis. Yet the timing may pose strategic risks. By striking shortly after a perceived violation, and while key elements of the truce remain in negotiation, Israel risks undermining the very architecture of the ceasefire it helped negotiate. Hamas clearly sees that risk. The militant group denies involvement in the soldier attack and accuses Israel of violating the deal first. Underlying the public rhetoric is the unresolved issue of the hostages. Israel contends that 13 bodies are still being held inside Gaza. Hamas released partial remains overnight of a hostage previously accounted for, but refused to hand over another body, citing alleged Israeli violations of the ceasefire. That dynamic, hostages for specimens of conflict resolution, has haunted the Gaza war for months. Every time the remains issue deepens, the risk of broader collapse in talks increases, and each side knows it. For Israel, the return of hostages remains a rubric for maintaining public support of any diplomacy. For Hamas, the hostages are a key bargaining chip. Meanwhile, President Trump's trip continues to loom large. His visit to Japan comes at a moment when Washington seeks to anchor a broader vision of US involvement across Indo-Pacific trade and strategic networks. From there, South Korea awaits, desiring both economic and security commitments amid intensifying competition with China. The meeting with China's Xi Jinping further signals the administration's willingness to engage with Beijing, even while confronting China on trade, supply chains, and emerging technologies. That global agenda faces a test. Can high-stakes diplomacy across Asia survive or proceed, even while the Middle East explodes anew? For the US, it is not a question of choice. The pieces are moving in parallel. The risk is that shifts in one theatre, Gaza, ripple into the rest. If the ceasefire collapses, American and allied resources, attention and credibility may be drawn in. Should the ceasefire hold, despite small skirmishes, then Washington, Jerusalem and Doha, Qatar, Egypt mediators may be able to move to phase 2 of the deal, further humanitarian access, prisoner hostage exchanges, possible Israeli withdrawal and aid guarantees. The Vice President's remarks suggest that this is still expected, but the alternative looms. Israeli strikes could amplify into a full-scale campaign. Hamas could retaliate harder. The humanitarian situation in Gaza could worsen, and Washington could be forced into deeper involvement, either as mediator or logistical backer of escalation. In that scenario, the president's global swing could be overshadowed by crises closer to home. Will Hamas agree to release the 13 bodies Israel says remain held? The outcome of that decision may determine whether the truce continues or collapses. Will Israel continue its powerful strikes in Gaza? And if so, how large-scale will they become? The Israeli mode of response will shape whether the conflict remains contained or escalates. Will Washington intervene more directly, publicly or behind the scenes? And will the president address the Gaza developments while in Asia or after his return? How will the Asia trip proceed while this Middle East crisis unfolds? Even carefully coordinated diplomacy may face reputation risk if the Gaza situation derails global optics. What happens to phase 2 of the ceasefire? Is it formally initiated, delayed, or abandoned? Many moving pieces remain. President Donald J. Trump's global tour is meant to showcase America's re-engagement with major trade and security centers, Japan, South Korea, China. But even as the president steps onto that stage, the erupting flare-up in Gaza reminded the world that US foreign policy still operates on multiple axes and that a problem in one region can suddenly dominate the narrative elsewhere. In Gaza, Israel's leadership appears determined to assert that a ceasefire is not a cover for attacks. Hamas, meanwhile, holds the hostages and remains issue as both bargaining technique and symbol of power. The US, through Vice President J.D. Vance and other envoys, is holding firm to the deal-making process, even as it concedes that small skirmishes may happen. The coming hours and days will test the durability of the truce and the coherence of America's broader global agenda. Whether the president's economic and strategic objectives in Asia can coexist with new conflict in Gaza remains a key question, one that may tell us a great deal about how his administration manages overlapping theatres of diplomacy, conflict and agenda setting. For now, the message from Washington is, the plan goes on, but the margin for error is thinner than ever. And for Jerusalem and Gaza, the next move may determine whether the ceasefire stays alive or becomes the prelude to another wave of war.